Crenshaw to use such methods of organizing and education and convincing our elected officials and bringing the community together to oppose projects that literally can lead to our displacement, literally lead to our death. And so this Bay Area YIMBY group came out of left field and chose this project among hundreds which are heard from. I'm saying hundreds of land use projects are heard from in the state of California. Just to weigh in saying that against the wishes and wills of an organized Black group asserting its right to self-determination with the support of Black elected official, the local Black elected official, it should be approved. Ultimately, after the planning commission had ruled that the project was inappropriate and on gentrification grounds, they were forced to by a court to approve it because it did not comply with the Housing Accountability Act. Next slide, please. And so who was behind this? Ultimately, YIMBY, NIMBY, it's not really about any individual, it's about the power that's behind it. And Peter Thiel is a Bay Area-based billionaire. He's a big tech founder of PayPal and a venture capitalist, a major Republican donor and supporter of Donald Trump, who has a very libertarian belief, who believes strongly in this concept, this fantasy of trickle-down housing theory, that if you just create market rate housing everywhere, it will make more affordable housing. There's nothing in the history of American housing to suggest this. And we can dive deeply into that even more to talk about how the real estate investment and construction market actually operates versus this, frankly, fantasy that real estate investors are social service agencies that are suddenly going to build themselves out of the profits that they're earning. He was an early supporter of YIMBY and specifically the founder of Carla. And so let's just dive into that a little bit more. Big tech, libertarian theory, using the power of the state to push loans to underwrite and undermine the power of local communities and local municipal entities to determine how development would take place. This is consistent with the pattern of disempowerment that has been going on since the days of redlining. Continue. Next slide, please. And we see this even more overtly. There was a famous battle 2 years ago with SB 827, and it was again put up again in SB 50, both of which were rejected. Where the law, someone mistakenly had let it be known that this law, which was going to rezone a large portion of the state of California, taking the power again away from communities to decide their fate, and it would be, in the case of Los Angeles, most disruptive in South Central. They're admitting that this is a disruptive thing, and already a community of color that, in a Black community specific, that is filled with marginalized people. So in so many respects, we have to recognize this is intentional. We can't say that these are just, unintended consequences. It is known what happens when bad capital and increased speculation happens in communities that already have been marginalized. Next slide, please. And so we have seen, again, with reference to New York, the effects of rezonings in communities that is disproportionately Black and in communities that are disproportionately Black, that these rezonings are harmful. And we should consider them indeed this new incarnation of urban renewal, one where in the past, slum clearing and blight designations, freeway routing was used to destroy Black communities, but now we're trying to use the power of a quote unquote free market. We're trying to use capital to intentionally strengthen those already in power, to exacerbate inequality and destabilize communities through upzoning, through rezoning, so that we can remake, and I say we in the context of government and society, places where Black people currently occupy into spaces for a more affluent and wider gentry. Next slide, please. Oh, so now we dive into a bit. I know there might be questions, I'll pause right there. There might be questions on the Crenshaw Mall. And I want to just briefly state that, again, I'm done with the slide deck, that project and process, which is the largest developed, or would be the largest development within the city of Los Angeles, was one in which the community said that we weren't going to be gentrified out, that we would come together as a community organization, as a community force, and seek to buy the largest commercial asset in all of Black Los Angeles, and by that definition, one of the most significant commercial assets across America. And what we saw as we negotiated with Deutsche Bank and submitted bids and often submitted higher offers than the gentrifiers who wanted the project, is that and what we found in that process was that they actually were operating at the behest of public pension funds. Los Angeles County Employee Retirement Association, UC Board of Regents, Los Angeles Fire and Police Pension Fund, New York City Employee Retirement System, New York City teachers, Michigan, state of Michigan employees. They were all investors in a project to gentrify the community. And they were all giving direction to Deutsche Bank, who was deciding whether to sell this major commercial asset, which we wanted to have as a space for community healing and uplift, not uproot, or to sell it to a gentrifier, which they ultimately did, who was backed by speculative capital seeking to cash in again on that rent gap. There'll be a lot more about that. We're actually working on a civil rights lawsuit right now pointing to racism in contracting, where they literally rejected the highest offer from us on multiple occasions, engaged in practices where we literally would not be spoken to. The Black people who were leading this would not be spoken to, and the white decision maker on the other side, we had to use white emissaries to relay information to them. They weren't speaking to the Black local residents that were in control of the tens of millions of dollars of funds that would have been required to acquire the project. So I'd love to talk about that a lot more. I know the presentation was to be concentrated. And again, I invite this dialogue to continue. But I also want to say that before I intentionally did not have multiple solutions, because that's a long conversation. And I think that when we talk about the solutions to gentrification, as honorable and able as this commission is, you cannot do it in the hour. And they are multi-pronged. They are deep. The CLBC needs to consider this a critical issue that it goes into. You need to have entire days of experts dedicated to this, because as I said, and as I began with Malcolm's quote, it is land that is the basis of all independence, of freedom, justice, and equality. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Damian, for that thorough and enlightening presentation. So now I'll turn to the task force members for questions or comments and discussion, and just making a note that we're a bit over time, but that's okay. We'll adjust accordingly and make sure to give a break as well. So are there any questions or comments from the task force at this time for our panelists, Daryl Owens, Brandon Green, Zarita Jones, and Damian Goodman? Oh, I have a question for Brandon Green. So is there anything that you can see that the task force assisting with in terms of the legislation that you were talking about earlier, the proposed legislation?
I think yeah, to the extent that the task force is being provided with all of the information about the ways in which homelessness is actually a racial justice issue that disproportionately impacts Black folks, and it has ties to the carceral system and to sort of the economic longevity of Black folks. And the task force is a conduit to carry that information forward to other levels of government. Obviously, Senator Bradford and Joan Sawyer here as well, but I think the task force being a conduit for that information, the information that is presented by the other panelists as well, to not only the legislative offices, but to the governor and others, is helpful in situating both that particular proposal and other proposals that community advocates are presenting as those that would move forward in terms of a reparations framework to housing, homelessness, and the other issues that were presented, particularly the intersections between those things and the carceral system, and the push out in historically Black communities that are not only have economic consequences, but social and political consequences as well.
Thank you. So I'll recognize Member Grills, but I also want to say that I made that question because we have conversations around low-hanging fruit, and I want the task force to, we should start considering or thinking about what are some wins, what are some things that we can put into action before, I guess, the end of the process, right? Because we could wait until the end of the process to start developing reparations proposals or taking particular actions, but we can also try to think creatively about how to pick that low hanging fruit. What are some things that we can do right now to not only amplify the great work that we're doing in these public hearings, but in the case that we can develop a reparations proposal, before the half of this process is over, and that can go to supporting particular legislation like you suggested. I think those are conversations that we should start to have. Did you want to follow up, Brandon Green? Then
And I
we'll go
just,
to
if I could just add one more quick thing, that intersection between houselessness and the carceral system, there's other legislation as well. I'm part of the Debt Free Justice Coalition, which over the years, first with Holly Mitchell and then with Senator Skinner and others, Senator Bradford last year, have been successfully pushing legislation to get rid of criminal administrative fines and fees, for example. Those are the sorts of fines and fees that accompany the criminalization of homelessness. So, Lawyers Committee last year put out a report about non-traffic stops and how disproportionately they impact Black people and disproportionately impact unhoused folks. These are quality of life citations, for example. And those are the sorts of things that are at this intersection. That is also an area of legislation that the task force or individual members of the task force could support as well. So I just wanted to make sure that I added that.
Member Reggie Jones Sawyer Bradford, can you remind us, when does the California legislature reconvene? And then we'll go to Member Grill.
January 3rd.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Member Grills, you're recognized.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank the panelists who presented this afternoon on a topic that we don't hear enough about. And my question can go to any and all of the panelists, and that is, what reparation strategy should the task force prioritize to move the needle in a substantive way around issues of gentrification and houselessness? And then also, is anyone tracking the quality, the consequences of gentrification and houselessness on the quality of life, health, and mental health of Black folk?
I have ideas, but I just spoke, so I want to let the other folks speak first if they have some.
Well, I can dive in. I guess the framework again is about power. If you are engaging in policy that seeks to empower those who are already doing harm, you're not going in the right direction. So how do you transfer power to Black communities? The best example of a community, and it's within every urban planning school's syllabus across America and some across the world, is that of Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, where the state actually transferred eminent domain power to a community-based group. One of the first executive director of that is actually on our board for downtown Crenshaw Rising, and actually lives in Leimert Park, and his family was one of the first people in Leimert Park. And so he reminds me that simply having that power, he never had to exercise it. But the threat of it allowed absentee property owners who were using the Dudley Street neighborhood in Boston as a dumping ground to sell to the community, which now is under community control and being used as a means to heal lots of social ills. It's a holistic program that the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is. So there's a similar action, or just talking focused on eminent domain here locally, where the Hillside Villas, this is within Chinatown, is dealing with the lapse of covenants, affordable housing covenants, and is asking the city to exercise its eminent domain power to acquire the building stabilize the tenants who otherwise would be pushed out because the covenants are now lapsing, the rents can now go to market. You can dive into a whole history and need for transferring power from landowners or property owners who own multifamily housing to renters. There is no existence of actual rent control in the state of California, which is why we've seen formerly strong Black cities like Oakland literally become unaffordable overnight because of vacancy decontrol, whereby when the tenant is either pushed out or voluntarily leaves, the rent can go to market rate. Vacancy control, which was adopted in very few places in California prior to the adoption of Costa-Hawkins, actually had a city that is now currently completely unaffordable, Santa Monica, be an affordable and mixed income city. But the absence of it has now made it into one of the least affordable cities in all of Los Angeles. Again, power. That power is now with those apartment owners and not with those tenants who in the state of California are disproportionately Black.
I would say, I meant to mention this in my testimony, but neglected to, that only 1 in 4 eligible households receive subsidies, housing subsidies, for example. And because we know who is disproportionately rent or severely rent burdened in jurisdictions, like that's an area, obviously, housing subsidies are federal, but there's no reason why California couldn't have or create some sort of similar program, right? And I think this intersection of the carceral system is an important point because folks exiting the system are severely at risk for entering homelessness, right? So the way in which we create services for folks, subsidies for folks exiting incarceration is important. And then because of the cost of just existing in California, in the Bay Area in particular, that also then is going to dovetail with access to higher income wages and jobs, for example, because we know that, for example, in Oakland, even if you make minimum wage of $15 an hour, like you're not going to really be able to afford a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment there, or almost all of your income would go towards that. And because while there's been work done in terms of the barriers for access to jobs for people exiting incarceration, like those barriers are still there, and a lot of those jobs are not paying enough to be able to afford to rent an apartment, which then puts folks at increased risk. And some of these other things around, the criminal fines and fees, as I said, that become an albatross for folks is important too, because those are severe wealth extraction policies that, while race neutral on their face, are targeted at Black people through racialized policing and other things. And because Black folks are overrepresented in unhoused communities, and unhoused communities are overrepresented in those targeted by police, then that intersection of race and houselessness becomes a contributing factor that makes it more difficult for folks to be able to exit homelessness, for example.
And then we'll close out with Vice Chair Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of our task force. I'm sure I'll voice your sentiment collectively to say that we are very much informed and inspired to see homelessness in a light that we have the moral obligation to hear and to heed what they've said in order that we might include their concerns in our priorities as a task force. Thank you so much for what you shared with us. And Brother Damian Goodman, did I understand it correctly that you are the descendant of Colonel Allensworth?
Great great granduncle who was married to Nella Allensworth, his daughter.
Well, you are a reincarnation of his spirit. Do you know he was also pastor of the Union Baptist Church of Cincinnati, Ohio, during the days of Reconstruction? And he succeeded one Charles Satchel, who came across the Oregon Trail in 1856 to be the first African American pastor of the historic Third Baptist Church of San Francisco. And the peculiarity of all of those faith leaders was that they had more than going to heaven on their minds, but they were all fighting to enjoy having a piece of this good earth. And you know, Vernon Johns, who preceded Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, said once, if you want to see a classic example of perpetual motion, sell a Cadillac car to a black man and tell him to park it somewhere. Well, thank God, your great-great-grandfather, uncle that is, was not in perpetual motion. He made every effort that could be made for us to have that town, Allensworth, where he envisioned the replication of Tuskegee in the western United States. But again, because of oppression and the meanness of a racist society, that community was never realized. And we ought to include that, Senator, in this reparations plan, restoring the town, Allensworth. So it makes me happy to see you and that you have the spirit of your ancestor.
Thank you so much, Vice Chair Brown, for those closing powerful comments. I want to take this opportunity to thank, on behalf of the task force, Brandon Green, Daryl Owens, Zarita Jones, and Damian Goodman for your incredibly thorough and powerful and inspiring testimony on the issues of homelessness and gentrification. And we look forward to continuing this conversation, staying in contact with you all, and building upon this work.
Thank you.
So, thank you. So, recognizing we're a bit over time, I wanted to turn to the task force for insight. Would you all like to do our break for 5 to 10 minutes, and we can decide what time frame we want to do that, or should we go straight to the outline portion of the agenda? Any comments or like strong inclinations for what we do? Should we do a break? I think we should take a break. I don't know. I think a break is good. So we'll reconvene. We'll take a 10-minute break. Yeah, we need a break. So we'll reconvene at 3:40, 3:40-ish. Okay, thank you.
call you as soon as I get in the car. I'm just walking through. I'm right here now. I'll
Yep.
call you right back.
Okay.
Okay. The time is 3:40, so we will reconvene the meeting. But before we reconvene, I will turn to Parliamentarian Johnson so that she can establish a quorum. Parliamentarian Johnson?
Yes, Madam Chair. I will call the roll. Chair Moore,
Present.
Vice Chair Brown,
Present.
Member Bradford. Gotcha. Member Grills,
Present.
Member Holder,
Present.
Member Jones Sawyer,
Present.
Member Scott Lewis,
Present.
Member Tamaki,
Present.
Member Montgomery Stepp, Member Montgomery Stepp. The task force consists of 9 members. 5 members are needed for a quorum. There were 8 members present. Madam Chair, a quorum has been established.
And Ms. Johnson Bradford just vocalizing present for you.
Thank you. I did check. I have you. Thank
Great,
you.
thank you.
Thank you very much, Parliamentarian Johnson. So it was important that we establish a quorum, particularly for this section of the agenda, because the task force must vote to authorize the staff to proceed with drafting the report. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to, well, I'll take suggestions, but I was going to just give a brief introduction of each section of the outlines in which we've received, and then we can have a conversation based on each of those sections, so one at a time, essentially, and then we can take a vote one at a time, or we can wait to vote towards the end. I think for purposes of clarity, I think it might be helpful for us to just take each section one at a time. And then we can, take separate votes. But if anyone has any other suggestions, that's fine too. So in preparation for this meeting, I asked the California DOJ staff to create section introductions or blurbs based on each section of the report outlines that we've received. Partly just to remind us as task force members of each of these sections and what the overview of each of these sections are, but then also to educate the California public and remind the public that not only are we hosting these virtual public hearings, but we're also in the process of creating a 2-part written report. And we have received outlines for 12 sections, and those 12 sections will consist of our first written report. And then after we authorize the California DOJ to proceed with these outlines, then they'll give us additional reports for section 2 or report 2. So again, just to summarize, we are going through each of the 12 sections of the first written report draft outlines, and we're having a discussion about any key takeaways that we want the California DOJ staff to adhere to as they continue to draft the report. So for the first section of our first report is a section on slavery, and it was written by Professor Stacy Smith. In the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to read the entire blurb that the California staff wrote for the purposes of this conversation. So I'll just say just a few key points from this section for the benefit of the public. So the first section of this report on slavery, Stacy Smith is helping us to write on the institution of slavery and the enslavement of people of African ancestry in colonial North America and the United States from the 1500s to 1865, as well as the aftermath of emancipation during the Reconstruction period. She will also, in the report of this section, there's also a discussion on slavery in California and elsewhere. And yeah, I'll stop there because there's a lot that I'm really conscious on time, so I don't want to read the entire blurb. But the task force members are aware, we're all aware of the contents of the outline. So I'll stop talking now and turn it over to the task force. And going through and reviewing section 1 on slavery, were there any points that we wanted to raise to the California DOJ about this particular section?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
I'd like for us to consider as an entitlement, we will not use the phrase slavery, but enslavement. Because what happened to us, it was done by force and by legal public policy. It wasn't like, as it was in ancient times, that people were, because of their doings, were indentured servants or enslaved. This was an organized, systematized, legalized enslavement coming from the hand and the minds of people who were just downright evil. So it was enslavement.
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Brown. That's actually something that I wanted to raise as a suggestion for the next batch of outlines. I'm sure everyone knows about the 1619 report. Nikole Hannah-Jones, she was recently on a podcast, I think through NPR, and she said that she created a language guide for the 1619 report to make sure that all the language was consistent. And so, for instance, to Vice Chair Brown's point, in the language guide, she pretty much stated, all the writers that are going to be involved in the 1619 project don't refer to enslaved people as slaves, refer to them as enslaved, don't refer to plantations as plantations, but to forced labor camps, things like that, to be very intentional about the types of language that we're using. And so I thought that was very informative. And, if we could apply something similar where we're being, as intentional with the language that we're using in this report to make it as groundbreaking and as truth-telling as possible. I think that would be a good point of order. Did anyone else have any comments? Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
Along a similar line as Pastor Brown and you, Camila, I mean, Japanese American redress and reparations went through the same thing. The government had called the mass incarceration as first relocation and then evacuation and then assembly centers rather than, military style detention camps, internment instead of incarceration. So it does have an impact on the public, I have to say. The words matter. And so I think that's a great idea.
Madam Chair, point of information, are you going to ask for a motion to make those corrections in this report and then going forward to have some consistency with respect to the language?
Yes, I think we're taking global comments about section 1 on slavery. We're having a discussion about just any global comments, and then we'll take a motion after that discussion. So, Member Reggie Jones Sawyer, you're recognized.
I'm not wedded to any language whatsoever. I just want to make sure we don't become exclusionary, that we just don't look at it as the individuals that went through the Middle Passage that came here. In addition, we had peonage, where Black men mostly would be sent to prison and put in prison camps to do work for white after we were emancipated. And so in a lot of ways, we were chattel to white businessmen in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, in which eventually peonage was eliminated. But I just want to make sure that we don't narrow it to a point. I like the fact that hopefully that term enslavement expands it so it takes in every type of grievance that we can put up to ensure that we can get the maximum from reparations, or that we can prove the maximum for reparations, and that whatever title we use doesn't preclude us, and this may be the lawyers that need to get involved, doesn't preclude us from being able to do things. We in the legislature, we argue about things all the time, like, will or must, shall or will. I just want to make sure we are intentional, and our intention is to make sure we don't exclude any type of wrong that our people have suffered.
Enslavement is under that umbrella. It's all the same, wherever it happened, even with the vagrancy laws, where they arrested our people and put them into that evil system of peonage. Sharecropping.
Good. Sharecropping is another good example. Right.
Member Holder, you're recognized.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, along those same lines of what Member Jones Sawyer was articulating, I think we've already received the outlines and reviewed them, but the outlines are just still the draft form. So my recommendation is that, going forward, we think about some of the testimony that we got today, that we heard today about, about framing this in terms of wrongdoings, wrongdoers, in order to anticipate some of the legal challenges that we might get down the line, to make sure that our analysis is strong and can withstand public and judicial scrutiny. So to the as this is being drafted, I really think some of what we heard about framing the legal analysis should be incorporated into the way we draft this and some of that language as well.
Member Bradford, you're recognized.
I'm sorry, I stepped away again. So are we discussing now the definition, or how do we describe who's entitled? I'm sorry, I stepped out for a minute. Just want to be
That's
clear.
okay. So we're having a conversation about the draft outlines. So we're having the conversation based on each section. So right now we're on section 1, which is on slavery. But for the interest of time, rather than voting on all of these directives, I think we can just agree that the California DOJ staff will do all of what, you know, we're directing them to do. So they're listening intently to this conversation. So for instance, we're on section 1, which is on slavery. We've heard from Vice Chair Brown about, you know, not using the word slavery, but enslavement. You know, we've heard from Member Holder about ensuring that we're kind of inputting into to this report language around wrong-based harms to anticipating illegal challenges. And then I also had me and Tamaki had a similar conversation with Vice Chair Brown about like being intentional about the language. And I even want to ask if, you know, it would be helpful to form an advisory committee of some sorts to develop like a dictionary of like of language that we would want to use for this report. And then we can ensure that that final report utilizes that dictionary. That's just something that I'm throwing out there. So that's where we are. So are there any other global comments about section 1? If not, we can go to section 2. So Member Gross, you're recognized.
Just along the lines of words matter and languaging is important, I had similar comments in my review of the outlines about the word slave and slavery. But I also have a concern with the use of the phrase slave trade. And I would encourage us to use a different term, because in fact that dilutes what was actually happening. It was not a bona fide trade that was going on, and I think that minimizes the cruelty and the deceit in the process that was happening. Human trafficking and a whole bunch of other terms come to mind, but it was not a trade. And I'm not sure when you're referring to section 1, because if that includes the component on, no, I think it doesn't. I'll leave it at that. I have a concern on another area, but it's not the institution of enslavement.
Member Scott Lewis, you're.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on Dr. Gross' comment and say that I agree with that assertion and the spirit of the conversation so far. But I would argue to kind of keep the trade and then add the trafficking, because in naming it as a trade, it makes clear the foundational role that slavery had for Western European and North American economic foundation. So we have to kind of maintain the kind of economics of the process, and I think, you know, losing track of that can somehow undermine, I think, some of the longer term arguments that we're making. Right? So in other words, the slave trade or the trafficking and the trading of trafficked people is part of this longer trajectory where we see the dispossession, right, of Black neighborhoods in Oakland as being a part of the same process of economic development for the state of California. And so I think it's important to kind of keep that language, but also make it more complicated.
So the first section of the report is on slavery, and the second section of the report is on racial violence. So Member Gross, did you want to make a comment about the institution of slavery, an additional comment before we turn to section 2, which is on racial violence? Okay. So,
Madam Chair,
mhm,
I
Vice
thought,
Chair
I thought,
Brown.
I thought we were going to come to some consensus and use that universal language with enslavement that would encompass all the other fallouts that have been enumerated. If we could make that official, I'd like to make a motion.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. I offered the idea of an advisory committee to help develop like a language guide similar to what Nicole Hannah Jones discussed, what she used to create the 1619 project. So, I can volunteer to be a part of that. Vice Chair Brown, did you want to create a motion regarding something like that?
I shall move.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
So it has been properly moved and seconded that the task force creates an advisory committee. An advisory committee is 2 members, if I'm correct. The subcommittee would be more than that. So an advisory committee to help create a dictionary or language guide that will then be used to create the final report. Is there any discussion on this matter? Would anyone else like to volunteer to be a part of that process? I can also get it started. Oh, okay. Member Reggie Jones Sawyer. Okay. Is there any other discussion on this matter? If not, I would like to turn to Parliamentarian Johnson so that a roll call vote can be established. Parliamentarian Johnson?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Chair Brown? I'm sorry. Chair Moore?
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown?
Aye.
Member Bradford?
Aye.
Member Grills?
Aye.
Member Holder?
Here. Aye, sorry.
Thank you. Member Jones Sawyer?
Aye.
Member Scott Lewis?
Aye.
Member Tamaki?
Aye.
Member Montgomery Stepp? Madam Chair, there were 8 votes cast, and there were 8 yeas, and 0 nays.
Thank you. There were 8 yeses, so the motion carries, excuse me. So now that we have moved on from section 1, which is a section on slavery, and we came out with an action item to establish an advisory committee to help solidify the language for the final report, we'll now move to section 2 of the report, which is on racial violence. And this was written by Edward Nugent. As a quick overview, the racial terror section addresses the history of violence and terror inflicted upon Black Americans through centuries of U.S. history, starting with slavery and continuing through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights era, and present day. The section also highlights the particular history of racial terror in California. So in addition to prominent examples of racial violence in California, the section explains the history of the KKK in Southern California, the Central Valley, and the Bay Area, how the state government and local government supported and enabled racial terror, and how this history of violence continues to harm Black Californians and Black Americans today. Were there any global comments about this section in particular that the DOJ can use? I thought this section was pretty good. Straightforward. If not, we can just power along because I know some folks have comments for other sections. So now we're just going to power on to section 3 of the report, which is on political participation. And this was written by Deborah Tran. So as a quick overview, the political participation chapter discusses the ways that federal, state, and local governments have suppressed Black political power in the United States historically and to this day. So much of the chapter focuses on the right to vote and the various methods used to deny that right to Black Americans, including poll taxes, literacy taxes, grandfather clauses, racial gerrymandering, all white state primary elections, and other instrumentalities. Are there any global comments on this section in particular? And I just want to remind the task force that we have some of the DOJ staff authors here that are able to answer any questions directly if needed. Okay, we can power through if there's no questions on this particular section. Okay, so the next section is section 4, which is a chapter on housing, which was written by Siwin Yang. So as a brief overview, this housing chapter will cover instances after the Civil War where federal, state, and local government officials working together with private individuals actively segregated American land into Black and white neighborhoods. This housing segregation occurred over almost 200 years and through a variety of different government strategies and policies. These government actions were intentional and they supplemented and intensified the actions of private individuals. Are there any global comments on this section? And let me know if I'm going too fast. I know the outlines we have are over 500 pages and yes, Member Groves, you're recognized.
I didn't have my hand up. I think.
Oh, sorry, Member Holder.
Yeah. You know, this report is so comprehensive, so I don't want to be nitpicky here or just parsing it apart too much, but there's just a couple of areas that I would like some exploration on that I didn't see, and maybe they were even there and I missed it. But with respect to housing and the history of housing exclusion, etc., I'm wondering if we can have some discussion or some explanation of policies and practices like blockbusting, sundown towns, and white flight. You know, some analysis that is specific to those policies, practices, and harms.
Can you expand on that a little bit more, Member Holder?
Yeah, and again, this is a massive report, so I might have missed it. There may have been some reporting on certain practices around housing historically, housing segregation and housing discrimination historically that I missed. But there were some prevalent practices that went on in the state of California and other states to create segregated housing and to, push Black people into ghettoized spaces. And a couple of those that come to mind are practices like blockbusting, which was a common practice. Dynamics like white flight, and the existence of, exclusively white spaces that terrorized Black entry in those spaces, like sundown towns. And so I'm asking if we can have a little bit of analysis. Those are just three that come to mind quickly, and I did not see an explanation of those dynamics or those practices. So I'm specifically asking if we could talk a little bit about sundown towns, block busting, and white flight in this report.
And
Thank you very much. Vice Chair Brown? Oh, Michael Newman, did you want to respond, or if not?
Now, there was a devaluation of black properties too. That aspect is not there, and that's caused us not to have an increase in our wealth.
I
Michael
was just
Newman.
going to say, sure. Thanks, Chair Moore. I was just going to say, I didn't know Member Holder. Well, obviously, we're hearing these comments and we're paying attention, as Chair Moore has mentioned. We're hearing all these comments, and we'll be working to incorporate all of the recommendations. When you were saying you wanted to have the discussion, are you saying you wanted to talk about it right now? We're presuming you mean included in the report, and we will take these comments and follow up.
Precisely.
Thank you.
Member Tamaki, Member Grills.
so maybe I'm overstating this, but I think the sundown towns may be covered in the racial terror part. Pretty sure block busting and housing discrimination in the form of restrictive covenants and white flight, devaluation of black properties. I think the material is in there. Now, whether it's sufficiently detailed is another question, but I'm pretty sure, in reading it, exclusively white spaces. I mean, there was discussion, for example, out of state, like Levittowns, but also developers within California that intentionally excluded blacks from suburban developments. So I think it's in there, but it may be that members would want more detail, but it's not as if the subject is omitted.
Yeah, and as I said, this is a massive report, and so so I apologize if I'm mischaracterizing it by saying certain things are missing. I think maybe the process that we can use is something similar to the glossary that we were talking about, where certain terms and terminology that is popularized is reflected in the analysis. Because what I imagine, I'm thinking about this very practically, is that scholars, the public, eventually are going to be looking at this report, and they're not going to be able to read all 1,000 or 2,000 pages. They're going to be maybe interested in a certain subject, and maybe if there's a popular term like blockbusting, right? That's one way. That's one way for people to be able to find subjects that might be of particular interest. So then my recommendation would be, if the analysis is there, think about some of the popularized terms that are easily recognizable that will help people find their way through this report, and maybe incorporate some of those popularized terms. It's more of a curating language thing that I'm talking about.
And I was just going to add, similar to Member Tamaki, that there is mention of sundown towns in the housing section in batch 1 outlines, but it is a brief paragraph, and it really doesn't go into detail about how sundown towns operated in California. So to your point, more analysis could definitely be done there.
Yeah, and I also have a comment, and this applies to the political participation in housing sections, but more so on the housing sections. And it's a language issue too. So to the extent that we're using Black and brown or people of color, like it would be great to be as specific as possible about like which community of color, which communities of colors, right? If we're talking about all, Black Americans, who's descended from chattel slavery, let's be as specific as possible with that. But when we talk about brown, like to the extent that there's research available, and there is, right, in connection to the report that we're making, if we can like be specific, like, are we Mexican American communities, Central American communities, I don't know, something a bit more empowering all around, and less kind of generalized language, I think that would be great. But we can discuss that during our advisory committee that we're going to establish. Okay. Are there any other questions on the section on housing? And I'll give people a minute to, look through the outlines for this particular section, because it is a bit long. So I'll just give people like a minute. I'm giving myself a minute as well. Okay, so if there aren't any other global comments around housing, we can go to section 5 of the report. Section 5 of the report is on the environment, and this was written by a staff member, Brian Bilford. So in brief, this section discusses the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and government redlining policies that have imposed environmental impacts which harmed and continue to harm Black Americans. Are there any questions, comments, concerns about the environment section? And again, I'll give the task force member some time to look through their comments on this section. Okay, I thought this section was very comprehensive. It detailed harms throughout the state of California, and talked about historical and present day harms as it relates to environmental racism. So the section was great to me, making a global comment. Okay, if there aren't any other global comments about the environment section of the report, I'll turn to section 6, which is on education, and I'll give task force members a minute to review their global comments on the education section. And as a quick overview, this section was written by Laura Fayer, and it discusses how the quality of education is the foundation for a good job, for building wealth, and in the words of the Supreme Court of California, for the preservation of the rights and liberties of the people. Yet it shows through this report how the government of the United States of America at all levels, and including that of California, deprived generations of Black Americans of the benefits of an education. Are there any global comments that task force members would like to share on the education section of this report. And again, I'll give task force members a minute or so to look through their comments, their past comments. The only global comment that I had was that I wanted to see a discussion of James Anderson's book, The Education of Blacks in the South, a more robust discussion, because I think that ties directly to our conversation around the Great Migration and the impetus and implications of the Great Migration. But that is it for me on that particular section. If there aren't any other comments on the education section, we'll move right along to the health section, which is the 7th chapter of our report, which was written by Roop Singh.
I think Dr. Grossman had comments on the education.
Yeah, thank you. I just have one comment related to the education section. I recommend an addition of a section that focuses on the issue of the misalignment between the culture and ethnic racial background of the teacher and the student, and also curriculum deficits in the curriculum in terms of Black students of African ancestry not seeing themselves reflected in the curriculum. And that has a direct impact on academic achievement, on sense of identity, on sense of belonging in the school. And there's a literature around that. And I gave some content and also recommended a couple of scholars to cite in that regard.
Yeah, and as far as additional information, hopefully I didn't miss this, and I don't want to mischaracterize the report, but I think it would be helpful to have a discussion within the report about disparities, continuing disparities that we see in expulsion and suspension rates of African American youth. The adultification of Black girls in school, and some more information on the school to prison pipeline and the push out of Black girls and boys.
Great, thank you for that. So the next, if there aren't any other comments on that particular section, we'll move on to section 7 on health. As a quick overview, this section of the report delineates or discusses how the United States has treated Black Americans as subhuman, destroying the health of Black communities through racist oppression, torture, sexual violence, abusive experimentation, forced labor, and harmful neglect. More contemporarily, this section of the report also discusses how Black American women face high rates of maternal death and adverse birth outcomes, how Black American children face disproportionately worse health consequences in school, criminal justice, and the foster care systems, and how the mismanagement of public health crises by the state and federal governments has resulted in adverse health consequences and disproportionate death in Black communities, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so this particular section ends with the statement that California owes health-based reparations to Black communities for institutional racism in healthcare, racist health laws and policies, eugenics, harmful experimentation, over-incarceration of Black Americans, and racist neglect of Black health. Health-based reparations for Black Californians are essential for the future of California. Are there any global comments about the health section of the report?
I would like to speak, Chair Moore.
Yes, you're recognized, Member Gross, excuse me.
Okay. So I'm still not finished with this section, so my comments are in that regard, but I really want to encourage us to not lump health, public health, and mental health under one umbrella, because then the mental health issues are so overlooked when it comes to understanding the racial terror and trauma that we experience, the ongoing racial oppression, racism that we experience, that to lump mental health up under the umbrella of health in general and public health kind of mitigates against us paying the right. Yes, you can. Sorry about that. My grandson came over this afternoon. Okay, sorry. But in any event, I really would encourage us to, at least in the heading, to put health and mental health. And then we can stay with the sections under that where we clearly give due attention to mental health.
Okay, great. Any other comments for this section? Okay, if not, we're going to turn, did I miss anybody? Okay, so we're going to turn to section 8 of the report on family, which was written up by Brian Bilford. So a quick overview, this section discusses how for over 400 years, the federal and state governments of our country have systematically decimated the Black family. They have done this both through official government action and apathy, as well as through the creation and support of racist policies and practices of private actors. So this section of the report discusses child welfare agencies and how they've targeted Black families for investigations and for removing Black children from their families at much higher rates than white families. And it also discusses how Black families are disproportionately targeted, particularly Black men and Black children, for punishment. All of these actions have caused well-recognized and devastating harms to Black Americans. Any comments on the family section? Okay. So hearing no comments on the family section, we'll go to the 10th section, which is on labor, which was written by Lisa Elrich. Again, as a brief overview, this section of the report will tell the story of Black Americans in the United States and how it begins with labor. First, as the purpose of slavery was to harness the labor of enslaved persons purely for the benefit of others. But then it's also going to discuss, Black codes, Jim Crow laws, how Black Americans were relegated as an underclass by restricting their access to labor markets and economic freedom. It's going to talk about how Black Americans have historically had more limited job opportunities with corresponding limits in pay and ability to provide for their families and build wealth. Are there any comments, global comments about this section in particular on labor? Okay. So, hearing no comments on the labor section of the report, I'll go to section 11 of the report, which is on the justice system. And this was written by Francisco Valderrama. As a quick overview, section 11 on the justice system will discuss continuous actions by government officials to treat Black Americans as inferior throughout American history, which have resulted in inequities in nearly every area of the criminal and civil legal systems. So it'll discuss how Black Americans have historically experienced marginalization, torture, and murder at the hands of the criminal justice system. But then it'll also talk about the effects of slavery in the civil justice system, particularly surrounding the reality that Black Americans, particularly those with low incomes, experience several systemic problems in the underfunded court systems, both nationwide and in California, that prevent them from accessing justice in the civil courts. Are there any comments, questions, or concerns about the justice system section of the report? Okay, hearing no comments or questions, we'll move to the last section of the report, which is on wealth accumulation, and this was written by Sri Panchalam. So as a quick overview, this section of the report on wealth accumulation will discuss how racial wealth inequality remains a persistent defining American issue and is not accidental. It'll discuss how the United States has systemically prevented Black American communities from building, maintaining, and passing on wealth because of the atrocities of slavery, segregation, racial terror, and institutional and systemic racist suppression. Are there any comments on the wealth accumulation section of the report? I did have a comment on this particular part of the report. So I noticed that this section had a standalone section for Black women and the impact of racist wealth building as it relates to Black women, but I didn't see a comparable standalone section for Black men. And so I didn't understand why that was the case. But if there's going to be a standalone section that discusses wealth building as it relates to Black women, I think it's only right and fair for there to be a standalone section for Black men, and particularly, and I put in my track changes, in the comments in my track changes, there are some pretty amazing scholars like Tommy J. Curry. He's like one of the founders of what's called Black Male Studies, and he wrote a book called The Man Not that really discusses the positionality of the Black American man in the United States. So I would like to, if we're going to have a standalone section, that talks about, Black women versus Black men in terms of wealth building and capacity, I think if we can call on, Dr. Curry and Black Male Studies in his book, The Man Not, that would be great. But then also I noticed what was something that was missing in the report, which is missing in a lot of reports like this. And it's that, for instance, a lot of reports don't, when we're talking about labor, employment, and wealth building, a lot of these reports do not include the incarcerated when we're having conversations about employment or unemployment. Usually the incarcerated are considered invisible and they're not counted. So for instance, and I can pull up the particular part of the report, but it's not necessarily necessary at this time. My major comment is just that, for instance, if you count the amount of Black men who are incarcerated in this state, who then, are now essentially slaves. They're enslaved by the state, making cents to the hour. If you actually bring in that data, you would find that in many instances, Black men get paid less than Black women. But when you take those that data out of the equation. When you render the incarcerated invisible in that way, you'll get a common stat that, Black men get paid higher than Black women, which is true in some particular ways, but in other ways, that is definitely not the case. And so in my track changes, in my comments in the track changes, I sent some reports from not only Dr. Tommy Curry, but from the Brookings Institute, that talks about this phenomenon. So I would love to see information like that reflected in the report to make sure we're being as comprehensive as possible. Are there any comments or questions to that, or any separate comments related to this section in particular? Okay, so if not, there's something else that I wanted to raise, but I'll just alone. Oh, Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
Are we missing arts, culture, and entertainment? Do we cover that section? I thought that was.
Yeah, that's something we're supposed to go through, but I didn't receive a blurb about that from DOJ staff. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. We can just have a conversation about it.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry. I have a real hard stop. It was at 4:30, and I got to take off. So I'm probably going to have to miss this vote.
Okay, thank you, Member Bradford. We'll see you in the next
Madam
year.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
the culture is at the top of the next page.
Okay.
Section 9 is at the top of the next page.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you for that. Thank
Okay.
you for that.
You're very welcome.
So now we'll return to the arts and culture section, arts, culture, and faith, which was written by Roop Singh. So as a quick overview, this section of the report will discuss the history of the United States, the federal government and state governments having, promoting, and generating cultural and artistic narratives that reinforce racist stereotypes about Black communities. And so it also has a discussion around how the state of California in particular has actively discriminated against Black American artists, culture makers, and people of faith. It also discusses how the state has neglected to protect Black American artists, culture makers, and people of faith from discrimination, and ends with a call for reparations for historical discrimination in arts, culture, and faith. Are there any comments on this particular section of the report?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
The hotbeds that gave growth to our artistic expressions have been destroyed. And specifically, the Harlem of the West in San Francisco. That stands out historically. But through gentrification, through economic deprivation, it has been virtually destroyed. I go back to my pet phrase, there's no watering hole here. Everybody else can go where they can get their cultural thirst quenched, but not for us.
Are there any other comments or questions about this section?
Yeah.
Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Yeah, I'd like to encourage a discussion about the capitalization of Black cultural creation. So not just from a discriminatory basis, but the way that Black cultural items are being used and capitalized on by these various industries.
Yeah.
Okay.
muted.
Was there a question about arts and culture, an additional question? If not, I wanted to return to the family section because I wanted to raise a question to the task force members. So there's a section in the family section that talks about like intramural or intercommunal violence, so to speak. And so I'm raising the question if you all think that, you know, that type of conversation should be in this report. And, you know, this isn't something that we have to, you know, talk about now, but, you know, it was something that I saw when I was reading through the section, and it didn't necessarily make sense to me for there to be like an in-depth conversation about issues of domestic violence and intimate partner violence in a report about reparations from the state. But I could be wrong about that, so I wanted to hear from other task force members about that. And again, this is something that we can resolve or discuss later, but I wanted to bring that up as a concern for me before we conclude.
So I'd like to make a brief comment on that. It depends on how it's framed, and I don't have that held in my brain, so I'm going to have to go back and look at it. Depending on how it's framed, it could be relevant. For example, if it is to demonstrate the damage done to one's psyche and mental health and behavioral health because there is quote unquote adhesion to the oppressor or there's internalized racism, then that is a way to demonstrate the harm done to couples and families as a result, psychologically, as a result of the legacy of enslavement and post-enslavement oppression tactics. So I'll need to go back and look at it again and see how they framed it.
Okay, thank you. That works great. That's the comment that I made. I didn't say that this section should wholesale be discarded. I just wasn't satisfied with the current framing and thought that it should be framed in a particular way in order for it to make more sense. You know, tying it to, like you said, like the legacy of slavery and things like that. So I definitely agree and look forward to your comments after going back.
I would say something. I would also say something similar about the arts and culture. I know it's just in draft form, but there needs to be more of a synthesis here, where we are connecting the dots a little bit more about how, you know, the negative imagery, the stereotyping that we're seeing in film and other media art forms, you know, how it is connected to perpetuating the colonized mindset, anti-Blackness. You know, just something that brings it a little bit closer to the present day and the anti-Black narrative that is a continuing narrative. So I would just recommend that sort of synthesis in the arts and culture. And a little bit more of a discussion of social media in that context.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much.
I think Brown has something.
Oh, Member Brown, Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized. You're on mute, Vice Chair Brown. Or is he on the phone? Be on the phone. Okay, so in the interest of time, like as I said, rather than voting on all of these directives, we can just agree that the DOJ staff, which, you know, they've been intently listening, will do, you know, all of what we're directing them to do in this conversation, and they'll follow up accordingly. And then again, we voted to create an advisory committee to help solidify a language guide that will be implemented through the final report. So thank you, members of the public and the task force, for your hard work and your diligence in getting through this agenda today. We are almost done. I promise. The last two parts of our agenda today are updates from the DOJ, and then we'll have a conversation about the public chat function and a vote and a possible action item on that. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to Michael Newman. Thank you.
Oh, wait, hold on a second.
Oh, Vice Chair. Oh, Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
I presume with this, we've approved the outlines so that the DOJ can proceed, unless that has to be done by motion. But I just want to make sure that the DOJ, because we're under pretty aggressive time frame, that's going to proceed. And just to comment, I think every member's comments are really great and really helpful. And some of the things that were raised, I guess it's a question of whether they should be raised in a different section. For example, the part about discipline in education, a lot of that ends up in the family, but maybe it should be moved to education. And with respect to, we just talked about domestic violence, whether that could be reframed as a mental health issue, maybe it belongs there. So perhaps the advisory committee that's working on the dictionary could also provide some guidance to the DOJ. But I have to say, in general, I think the DOJ team did a really good job. And I just want to point out that this report is different, for instance, than the 1968 Kerner Commission. I mean, I think the Kerner Commission arrived at the right conclusions. But if you look at the history portion that talks about slavery and Reconstruction, Jim Crow, redlining, and so on, it's literally about 50 pages. And this is a really massive and comprehensive connecting the dots between past racism and current consequences. And I think as far as the American public is concerned, it's going to be an eye-opener and something that will be looked upon by other states and other leaders. So I think, I just want to say that I think the outlines are really a great start for the report. And it will have to be very heavily footnoted with authorities noted, but I really think that this is a good deliverable for the task force. But with those changes that the members suggested.
Can I just echo what Member Tamaki said? I think that a tremendous amount of work has gone into these. They're very comprehensive and will take us a long way in being able to do some of the discussion that we need, that our speakers today pointed out, and particularly around being able to name the harms and use that in consideration of some of the deliberations that are coming.
So at this time, would any task force member like to entertain a motion in regards to the California DOJ being able to proceed with the section?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I second.
That's been properly moved and seconded that the California Reparations Task Force authorizes the California DOJ to proceed with the second draft of the outlines based on the conversation and consensus that the task force has just come to today. Are there any comments, discussion on this matter, rather?
Madam Chair, could you please identify who made the motion and the second?
Member Tamaki made the motion and Member Javon Scott Lewis seconded.
Thank you.
And I think just to correct the motion, Camila, sorry, no offense intended.
Thank you.
My understanding is that the report is that the authorization is
Not a
direct
second
to
draft.
direct DOJ to direct them to proceed with the drafts of the report. We're not going to see another set of outlines, but rather it will be proceeding ahead with the draft report.
Right.
Thank you so much for that clarification. So it has been properly moved and seconded that the task force authorizes the California DOJ to proceed with the drafting of the report based on the conversation that we had today. Are there any other discussion on this matter? Again, the vote is to approve the outlines and to move forward with the report. Hearing no further discussion, we will turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote. You're on mute, Parliamentarian Johnson.
Chair Moore, thank you.
Aye. Aye.
Vice Chair Brown. Member Bradford. Member Grills.
Aye.
Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder.
Aye.
Member Holder votes aye. Member Jones Sawyer.
Aye.
Member Jones Sawyer votes aye. Member Scott Lewis.
Aye.
Member Scott Lewis votes aye. Member Tamaki.
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Member Montgomery Stepp. Madam Chair, there were 6 votes cast, 6 ayes and 0 nays.
Thank you. So the motion carries. The ayes have it. So the motion carries. So we will move to the next item on our agenda. Thank you again to California DOJ staff for these outlines. As Member Grills and Member Tamaki said, these were absolutely outstanding and gave us a lot to work with. So we're definitely looking forward to the final outcome of the report. It should be groundbreaking. So, Mr. Newman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair Moore, for recognizing DOJ staff as you've just done. And I'm glad they were able to be on the meeting during this discussion so they could hear the positive comments. We really appreciate the feedback and comments and appreciation. I can say everyone's worked very hard to get where we are and appreciate those comments. With today's DOJ update, I want to follow up on several items discussed in my last DOJ updates and share some additional updates and information. During tomorrow's business session, we will be reporting out on or addressing a number of issues that have been raised by members or represent important business for the task force to address, including the required conflict of interest code, the task force's contracts and contracting process of the state, the addition of a January meeting on health and other issues, meeting on Saturdays, and various other matters. I will therefore hold any updates on those issues for the relevant discussions of each as included on the agenda, but we'll be happy to take any preliminary questions you may have on anything now if there are questions that may require overnight consideration by me or DOJ staff or research in advance of the discussions tomorrow. For now, I will say that taking all of your comments and input from the last section of the meeting we just concluded, we'll now turn to fleshing out the outlines you have just approved and returning to you in, I believe, the February meeting with draft sections for your further consultation and discussion. And of course, that'll be an ongoing process, including with the advisory committee you've all just created. We look forward to assisting you all in crafting a report that will convey all of the critical and impactful information being developed in the task force's meeting and research in developing an excellent compendium of information that should be groundbreaking and meet with the legislature's mandate. The most significant update I have at this time for this meeting is with regard to the meetings of this task force from February 1st, 2022 on. Under the Bagley-Keens normal procedures, members of state bodies are required to physically meet at a publicly noticed meeting site where the public will also be able to join. Members may only attend meetings remotely under limited circumstances, and all sites from which members attend must be noticed and open to the public and must be compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. These permanent requirements were modified by an executive order issued by Governor Newsom to allow for remote access, such as we are all using now, to curb the spread of the coronavirus. These modifications were extended through January 31st, 2022 through AB 361. But the exemption in AB 361 will end on February 1st, 2022, and return us to the requirements of the permanent law. Therefore, as of the task force's February meeting, which we'll discuss more tomorrow, we'll be required to schedule in-person meetings for the task force, which will mean the following key points. First, all task force members will be required to participate in the meetings in person, or if a member will be participating by teleconference from another location, we will need to know the location from which you are participating, and that location will be required to be included in our formal notice of meeting, open to the public and accessible for persons with disabilities. Second, the DOJ will need to brief each member on the process for scheduling travel to the location of the task force meeting and receiving reimbursement for attendance, which DOJ will coordinate through the state's travel reimbursement program. And we'll follow up with each of you one-on-one to provide all of the information, training, documents, et cetera, that you may need to be able to carry all that out. The task force, when setting future meetings, will need to also select a location in which each meeting will take place, in addition to the dates. Members can volunteer specific facilities or locations, or you could vote on a city in which you would like the meeting to take place, and DOJ staff can coordinate a location. And again, we'll discuss this more as we schedule each meeting moving forward, so that we can be responsive to the task force's directions and requests. And finally, the task force may need to seek an appropriation from the legislature, or DOJ may need to seek a supplemental budget change for per diem compensation and reimbursement of expenses for not more than 10 meetings as set forth in the statute. The 10 meetings that are stated in the statute are, set the cap on expenditures for these purposes, and those will kick in once we start meeting in person. I recognize that for this task force, the shift to in-person meetings represents a significant transition because you've never actually conducted an in-person meeting. We hope that having an opportunity to meet and hold a meeting in person in February will create opportunities for individual engagement of the members of the task force. As part of your discussion tomorrow in setting the agendas and dates for future meetings, you may want to also consider the location or locations, as I mentioned, in which you would like to have these in-person meetings take place. We look forward to working with each of you individually to support this transition, and we will provide another report in our January meeting when things become a little bit more concrete after you've had a chance to discuss, and we've had a chance to discuss with all the members of the task force one-on-one. With that, thank you very much, Chair Moore, Vice Chair Dr. Brown, and members of the task force for providing an opportunity for the DOJ to provide this important update. I welcome any follow-up questions from any members of the task force about the in-person meeting, other items, or as I mentioned, things that may come up tomorrow, or anything that I have not addressed that any members wish to seek clarity on.
I think I can only see you on the screen right now, Mr. Newman, but I did have a follow-up question. It's something that we can discuss so at a later date, but when we do transition to person meetings, will there still be capability to stream online, like for people who won't be able to attend in person?
This is a good question. Dr. Brown, do you have a what? No. Sorry, Chair Moore. It's a really good question. I think that is something we are still needing to look into. All I can say is typically, or if you look at the way the legislature conducts their work right now, what they do, and Member Jones Sawyer may be able to speak to this, but the legislature has sort of a camera that films, and I think it goes onto the website. But all the business of the meeting is conducted via phone. People calling in and offering testimony over the phone, and members sort of sitting in the meeting and listening to the information coming in over the phone. So I think we're still exploring what this means technologically, not just for this task force, but obviously for the dozens or hundreds of other state agencies that are making this same transition.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other updates from you, Mr. Newman?
No, that was the big update. And then tomorrow, as you see from the agenda, as we've discussed, there are a number of different items that the DOJ will be reporting out on and eliciting questions on throughout the day. So that'll be probably saving everyone's time. That'll be probably an opportunity for us to get more into detail on the different aspects of those issues.
Okay, thank you. Are there any Member Holder?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, and you may not know this, Attorney Newman, what kind of COVID protocols there are going to be for in-person meetings, whether there's like a rapid test requirement, stuff like that, whether that's, what stuff that the DOJ is, implementing or thinking about right now, and how much lead time will we have before, so that we know what kind of COVID protocols are going to be in place.
Yeah, this is a significant concern, and I understand that. We're still looking for guidance. I think we're hoping that there will be guidance coming in January, potentially from other state departments that are responsible for health response. And we'll be talking with each of the members of the task force over the course of the next month, and hopefully have some clearer idea by the January meeting that we can report out on that meeting. But this is certainly something we would need to develop in advance of any in-person meeting. And so we expect that there should be some more guidance as we close in on the February 1st date set by the statute.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for Mr. Newman? If not, we can move on to the last part of our agenda. Okay, thank you, Attorney Newman, and we'll see you tomorrow.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you. So the last part of our agenda for today is a review and discussion and possible action item about the public chat function. So yes, and if Attorney Newman, if you want to come back on for this, you can. But essentially, the public chat was on. Oh, Attorney Newman, can you just kind of give an overview on?
Oh, sure. No, I can't. Sorry, I just popped off. I didn't know if you wanted me.